If the Quebec government's proposed Charter of Values passes in the coming weeks, the province's public service employees will be banned from wearing or carrying any overt religious symbols in a move meant to firmly establish secularism in public life. Opponents say it's a challenge to Canada's values of tolerance and acceptance of diversity. Joining us now to discuss these two solitudes in Montreal, Quebec via Skype, Daniel Turp. He's law professor at the Université du Montréal. He's a former Bloc Québécois MP and a former member of the National Assembly of Quebec for the Parti Quebecois. Also in Montreal and via Skype, David Coussons. He is assistant professor at the Department of Religious Studies at the University of Sherbrooke and a Canada Research Chair on Religions in Advanced Modernity. And with us here in studio, Supriya Dwivedi. She is a political commentator on CJAD Radio in Montreal and a blogger with the Huffington Post. And as I welcome Supriya, you here in the studio, and our other two guests in Points Beyond in Montreal, we want to remind you that we would like you to participate in this broadcast and hear from you on this topic. Producer Sandra Jonas and the University of Waterloo political scientist Emmett McFarlane are hosting a Twitter chat right now, so chime in using the hashtag AgendaTVO and share your views with us. Okay, as I welcome everybody to the broadcast tonight, I want to start by playing a clip of the minister responsible for democratic institutions and active citizenship as he explains to Quebecers and Canada what this is all about. Roll tape.
For this religious neutrality to take shape in public institutions, it must also show in the people who work for them. We therefore propose to establish a duty of religious neutrality and reserve among state personnel. Political neutrality is already expected of public servants. We propose that religious neutrality apply to all people working for the state. This duty would mean that state employees could not wear conspicuous religious symbols while they work. By this we mean very visible, very obvious symbols. State services would also be provided and received with faces uncovered.
And let's follow up with that clip with a poster showing what the province of Quebec has put out, showing the do's and the don'ts, what you can and what you can't. And as you can see on the right-hand side of that frame, overt crosses or a hijab or a turban or a skull cap or the covering of the face would not be acceptable, although earrings or smaller, less ostentatious, if I can put it that way, rings would be acceptable. All right, let's get into this. This has been a major debate across the country for the last several weeks, and Daniel Turp, perhaps you could start us off by telling us why you believe Quebec needs a so-called Charter of Values.
I guess it's to complete the process of secularization in Quebec, a process that started in the early 1960s when the state of Quebec decided that religion and state should be more separated than they were in schools, in hospitals. And now the government has planned to make sure that the state is neutral through its agents, through the civil servants, to make sure that that kind of neutrality is a principle that is in force in Quebec.
Daniel, why are public displays of faith, in your view, of concern to this Quebec government?
Well, because I think if the state is to be neutral, its agents are to be neutral. They should appear to be, show they are. And the state is not an abstract concept. And if there is a need, and like many Quebecers believe so, to have symbols removed from buildings, well, obviously, state, through its agents, should also show neutrality. And it's true, it's creating a very heated debate in Quebec because some people want to make sure that freedom, fundamental freedoms like the freedom of religion is more important than the neutrality of the state. And the government of Madame Marois believes that there is a reason and a rationale in having state officials be neutral and not wear religious symbols.
David, do you agree that Quebec needs this so-called Charter of Values?
No, I don't think so. And I think Daniel Turp is not absolutely right when he says that the state, as the agent of the state, the civil servant, should be neutral to have a neutral action we don't have to forget that a secular state has some obligations. And these obligations are to guarantee the equality of citizens and the equality of citizens, even if they share some values, some beliefs that are not those of the majority. And this second obligation is to guarantee their freedom of conscience and religion and the expression of their beliefs. And if the state has to be neutral, it's to guarantee these rights. So the obligation is imposed to the state and not to the individuals. And I'm very concerned when I see that the government of Quebec define in the charter secularism as the equality, the separation between church and state neutrality, and forget the freedom of conscience and religion, which is a fundamental right, which is the obligation the state has to guarantee to the citizens.
Supriya, where are you on this issue of a charter of values?
To me, I think it's a complete smokescreen for what it really is, which is, it's completely discriminatory towards minority religions. It's a very good principle to have a secular government. It's the hallmark of any civilized society. However, this is affecting minority religions disproportionately than it is Catholicism, especially since they've made very clear, the PQ, that that giant crucifix that hangs above the National Assembly is to stay, as well as the fact that municipal council meetings are to, there's a case in Saguenay where they start the meeting with having God guide them. If this was something about being state neutrality, then that would be the first thing that they would want to get rid of, and yet it isn't.
Daniel Turp, you know that this issue of the cross hanging out in the National Assembly has been a bit of a big deal. We're taking a look at a picture of it right now. Can you explain how, on the one hand, it's a good idea to eliminate overt signs of religion in the public sphere, but on the other hand, it's okay to have that cross hanging in the National Assembly?
Well, it's not okay. I believe it's inconsistent with the principle of neutrality. I'm on record in saying that the cross should not be in the National Assembly when legislators convene to make laws for everyone in Quebec. And I agree with our colleague that probably is seen by many Quebecers, including those who want a charter of values, as inconsistent. Otherwise, the proposed charter will apply to all religions equally, because people that are Catholics or Protestants, Christians, will not be able to wear crosses if they work for the government. So I think there is a need for more consistency, and I hope when the bill is tabled, there is that consistency.
Supriya, let me follow up with you, because Professor Turp does make the point that you said minority religions would be sort of disproportionately affected by this, but the fact is you can't wear a big cross either, and obviously the vast majority of Quebecers are Catholic.
Right.
So how does this affect people who follow religions who are in the minority, more so than it does to those in the majority?
Well, I mean, if you're a practicing Muslim or a practicing Muslim woman and you feel that part of your faith is to wear the hijab, that's not exactly something that you can take off from 9 to 5. That's something that and I don't think it's the government place to tell any citizens how they should be practicing something that's so intimate, which is their own religion. And you know what? The Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms sort of agrees with me on this.
But if you're a very fervent Catholic and it has been your practice to wear a large cross, you wouldn't be able to do that either. You'd be affected just the same way, wouldn't you?
Yeah, I suppose, but I mean, you're still allowed to wear a small cross. There's no such thing as a small hijab.
Gotcha. David Coussins, is that an inconsistency in what we're dealing with here?
Yes, it is, on two reasons. First, as I said, the state neutrality is an obligation imposed to the state. And affirming that we should ban some ostensible symbols, the state finally does not respect its obligation of neutrality. How the state, a secular state, can decide which symbol is ostensible or not. Secondly, how a state can decide what skills a neutral state, a secular state, has to say that a crucifix is not anymore a religious symbol. It's not because in Quebec a majority of the population does not go to the church anymore, does not practice anymore, that the symbol is cultural. And I would like to say when Daniel Thorpe argued that the majority will also have to respect this obligation of neutrality, that it's not exactly the case. Who has an obligation to wear religious symbols? It's Muslim people and Muslim women who has to wear the hijab. It's the Sikh who has to wear the turban. But in the Christian religions, there is not such an obligation. There is not such an obligation. I can decide to wear a religious symbol, but it's not imposed by a text. And we create a discrimination which is not direct, but it is still a discrimination for the minorities.
Well, Daniel Thorpe, can I get you to speak to that? There, as in the way that David has explained it there, the new practice would not be equally in effect on Muslims as opposed to Christians. Is that a fair point?
Well, you know, I think in many religions, including in Muslim denominations and in others, some people would not think and would not believe that there is an obligation to wear a religious symbol at work, for example. So I guess it does depend on your relationship with your own faith, with your own church or denomination, and people have very diverging views. It's not only Christians who don't believe that they need to wear crosses and religious symbols. The issue is, in fact, it's a difficult debate. I admit it's a difficult debate because it's the idea that when you work for this state, your religion should not be prominent, and that only if you work for the state, because this charter, these new rules would only apply to those cases. In your private life, in the life, in your home, in the street, contrary to other countries like France, who has decided that there shouldn't be many symbols even in the public space, Quebec wants to have its state more neutral. It wants to have a secular state, and that could be seen as very inconsistent with the Canadian Charter or multiculturalism. But for Quebec, it seems reasonable, and it should have a margin of appreciation as a nation to provide for those new rules.
Now, I do appreciate your position on this, but I just wonder when push actually comes to shove, how this policy gets rolled out. For example, if you are, let's say, a woman processing driver's license renewals in the Department of Motor Vehicles or whatever you call it in Quebec, and you want to wear the hijab, and you currently work for the state, do you lose your job going forward?
I don't know what's going to be in the legislation, as if there's going to be issues dealing with acquired rights or a time frame in which you will have to adapt to the new policy. But obviously at the end, the idea is that people that work for the government should not wear religious symbols, whatever the religion is. So we'll see, and as Mr. Drainville pointed out in the document, there might be also some exemptions for some institutions, universities, CEGEPs, and hospitals. So we'll see. Those issues are not yet, I guess, decided, and we won't know until the law is tabled in November or December.
Understood. Okay, and Supriya, I wonder if this is a potential opening here for some common ground. If, for example, they said, here's our policy, but we'll exempt these various institutions, or perhaps, I don't know if they'd be prepared to go this far, but if you work for the state today, you can get grandfathered in under this policy, but as soon as you leave, your replacement can't do it. Would that make some of this go away?
I mean, it would certainly make the blow a little bit, it would soften the blow, definitely, but I think the fundamental problem with this is that you're telling people how to practice their religion. And I don't think the state has any place in that. So yes, if if, let's say, hospitals are exempt from this, universities are exempt, and people get grandfathered in, that's definitely better than the current position, because as you know, I'm sure Ontario has been putting out a big campaign to lure Quebec doctors in, and I think it would end up working. But at the end of the day, I am very uncomfortable with the fact of having the government tell you how to practice religion.
Well, you see, that's an interesting point, because if the issue is practicing your religion, should you be practicing your religion when you're working for the state, when the state is supposed to be separate from religions? And I think on that basis, one could argue that, no, you shouldn't. You shouldn't be wanting to practice your religion if you do choose to work for the state in a state that has decided it is neutral and that there is a separation between state and religions.
Sure, and I mean, Professor Torp, I absolutely agree with you there, but at the end of the day, how can you really say that what's in somebody's mind, right? You're never going to be able to control what somebody's thinking, and to think that when somebody takes off their kippah and then they're then at their office, all of a sudden Judaism is no longer part of their identity or their thoughts is completely ridiculous.
Well, I don't think it is ridiculous, because there's something about the workplace and about your duty as a civil servant of the state, and the idea that that is as important as your religious beliefs. And that's why you see there is a big debate. Some people want to make a case about their religion and wearing religious symbols, even if they're working for the state. And I think that is something that can legitimately be said as not desirable in a state.
David Puissance, maybe you could help us with some of the politics around this, and the biggest question is, why is this happening now?
No, but I just on this debate, I want to say that the huge problem is that proposing to ban the symbol, the religious symbol for civil servants, it's like if the government was saying that these values you have, these religious values you have, are incompatible with our shared values as citizens. So that's first a very wrong message. And the effects are very negative, I think, because this person, religious, and let's say Muslim person, immigrant person, work as civil servant for the state in Quebec. It means that they already accepted most of our, many of our shared values. If you work as a civil servant, you're not an integrist, you're not a fundamentalist, but you already accept the values shared by all the citizens. And secondly, I feel very concerned because you can't decide what is state neutrality and just decide on the basis of the visibility of the religiosity of the person. It is not because my symbol is visible in the public sphere that I am not neutral. And even a Christian can be very integrist and does not react with all the neutrality she should in the public sphere, but she's not visible. So we have to take that in consideration, and the state neutrality, you can measure it in the action of the civil servants, not in his appearance.
Okay, maybe Supriya, I can get you to speak to the issue of why this is happening now.
I mean, I think it's happening now because the PQ doesn't really want to focus on what's going on in the province in terms of the economy, right? Quebec's debt is at $258 billion in debt.
Which is the same as Ontario's, but they've got half the population.
Right, exactly. There's also 40,000 job losses since Pauline Marois has been premier, whereas the rest of the country has seen job growth, 20,000 in Ontario alone. And there is an ongoing problem with Quebec's high school dropout rate. So these are all pressing issues that the government just doesn't want to deal with. So why not scapegoat a bunch of hijabs, kippas, and turbans? Daniel
Turp, you've heard this criticism before, that this is, while it may be well-intentioned from a from a Quebec value standpoint, it's also an effort to change the channel away from an unpopular minority government. What's your view on that?
Well, I'm happy to begin with to be out of partisan politics, because I hear a lot of partisan politics on the part of your guests now, and I think it's now because the Charest government did not deal with the issue after Monsieur Bouchard and Monsieur Taylor tabled a report a few years ago on these issues, and they had recommended that there be a white paper on secularism. And Monsieur Charest just adopted a resolution in the National Assembly, and he adopted a resolution, Monsieur Charest himself, to leave the crucifix in the National Assembly. He initiated that motion. And why now? It's, I guess, because the Parti Quebecois, and I was there in the caucus when these discussions took place, adopted a program where it does suggest that if it's elected and it forms the government, it will deal with the issue, it will bring forward what it called then a charter of secularism. It put it in its manifesto, and it's just going ahead. And I think it could do other things. It could try to take care of what the terrible tragedy in Lac Mégantic, and take also measures concerning the economy. But I think this is an issue that needs to be dealt with, and the government is very courageous, because, as you see, it's creating a debate that won't be easy, that is divisive in many ways. But I guess that's what you do when you want to do something on a principled basis.
Well, we do want to share some polling numbers with you and our audience. This from Angus Reid Global. As of just a few days ago, people polled on the Quebec proposed law, and here's what they said. In Quebec, this is a winner. 68% of the public expressing support for this proposal. The rest of Canada, not so much. The numbers go from 37% to 53%. In Alberta, 44% support. In the province of Ontario, 40% support. Supriya, we get reminded all the time that Quebec is a distinct society. Whether you want to recognize it in the Constitution or not is a different question, but Quebec is different from the rest of Canada, and these numbers, like many others on other topics, show that. English Canada prizes multiculturalism. Quebec does not. Mm-hmm. So can Quebec decide in its wisdom if it wants to go another way?
I mean, yes, it absolutely can, but it would still be subject to judicial review in terms of the Supreme Court, and I think that's something that Quebec is going to have to face. If legislation is passed as the proposed charter as is, which I don't think it will. I think if it does pass, it will be a very much a diluted version if it gets passed at all. But Quebec is a distinct society, and that is something that I think any Quebecer will say, and anybody from outside of Quebec will say, and I think that's something that people can agree on. It just, what do we want to have as our distinctive feature? Is it that is it this that we really want as our defining distinctive feature, or should it be the fact that, you know, Quebec gave Jews full rights 30 years before Great Britain did, the first in the entire British Empire? Should it be that when Jackie Robinson couldn't find a home, you know, Montreal stepped up to the plate, no pun intended? These are the things that I pride myself as being a Quebecer, and I would hope that other, you know, Quebecers do as well.
David, there is, as Supriya has pointed out, there is a history of Quebec being very tolerant on some issues related to ethnic minorities. Is that at risk with this Charter of Values?
Well, first, the distinct society. It's important to say that we have some fears in Quebec. Quebecois have some fears. Fears linked to the fact that we are a minority in North America. A majority maybe in Quebec, but a fragile majority. And we have to take these fears into account. But what I regret in the debate is that the government is playing on these fears to promote a conception of secularism, which does not reflect our historical and juridical heritage of, in terms of regulation of religious diversity in Quebec. In Quebec, I'm going to give you a few, just one example. We have a tradition of protection of the human rights, the fundamental rights that are guaranteed by the Quebecois Charter of Human Rights. If we have a shared value, it is the Quebecois Charter of Human Rights, adopted in 1974. it is this charter of rights, and we should focus on this kind of values. It's more important than to try to play on the fears and exclude the other from the society.
Daniel Turp, let me try this with you, because one of the other things that we've heard is that this is a solution looking for a problem, as opposed to the other way around, which is the way it usually works. So I ask, has anybody in Quebec complained about the fact that they've had to have public services from somebody, for example, wearing a hijab or a skull cap?
But could I just come back to the polls and to be, I think, very, to get your listeners to be very well informed. There's a poll today in the Journal de Montréal which suggests it's much closer, that 43% of Quebecers are in favor of the charter, 42 are against, and there's 17% or 16% that are undecided. So the support, the 68% support you mentioned, is probably much stronger than it is now after a week of debate. So it's going to be very interesting to see how things go. And I guess there's not a problem, but there was a lack of making a decision on the issue to make secularism a principle enshrined in the law, in a fundamental law. It will be enshrined if a law is adopted in the Charter of Freedoms, Rights and Freedoms of Quebec. I guess the reasonable accommodations crisis that happened a few years ago, and there's elements of problems that you see every week or month. This summer it was the turban and in the soccer fields of Quebec.
Yes.
I think there is probably a need to define more clear principles, put it in the legislation, so that judges who eventually have to decide on these issues do not make the law themselves, and that's what's been happening. The Supreme Court of Canada, 9 judges have decided what these issues are all about. So we want the National Assembly to do that now.
Well, Supriya, let me follow up on that issue of the judiciary, because the federal government has said, I think to a lot of people's surprise actually, that it will challenge this. It will challenge this, take it all the way to the Supreme Court if necessary. What did you think of that when you heard about that?
To be quite honest, I'm not a big fan of the Supreme Court wading into Quebec matters as often as they do, especially because Quebec is a distinct society. But more than that, we're based on civil law. So a lot of the time, especially with cases that with respect to religion, I find personally, and I think Professor Turp might agree with me here, is that the Supreme Court often neglects to take into consideration Quebec civil code and our civil law tradition, and imports onto Quebec the common law tradition of the rest of Canada.
Even with a third of the judges on the court being from Quebec?
Even with a third of the judges being from Quebec, because a lot of the time when you read the dissent the Quebec judges are generally in the dissent.
Daniel Turp, were you surprised when you found out that the Harper government said it disagrees with this and will challenge this all the way to the Supreme Court?
Not at all. There's competing visions about how you deal with integration, with language, and with the principles of multiculturalism. And obviously the Harper government, and I wouldn't be surprised a Justin Trudeau government or a Mulcair government would exactly do the same thing. They would challenge the legislation, just as the language laws were challenged in the 1970s, because it's inconsistent with the way Canada wants to organize itself. And when Quebec has a distinctive view on that, well, there's now the charter that could prevent these distinctive views to be applied. And no, I'm not surprised. And the Supreme Court, Monsieur Lévesque or others even before him would say that it's like the Tour de Pise, the Pisa Tower. It always leans on the same side. If you want to have a good idea on how that might happen. In the Globe and Mail this past weekend, there was a folio. I presented an argument which suggested that the charter was constitutional. Julius Gray said it wasn't, and there were 9 selected judges by the Globe and Mail Supreme Court who decided 9-0 that it was unconstitutional. So,
yes, I saw that. You were a little outnumbered on that page, weren't you?
Boy, was I ever. But I accepted to be the advocate because I think there is a case to be made. And you know, it's interesting in Europe, and there are differences obviously between countries within Europe. In Europe, the European Court of Human Rights decided that in these matters, countries have a margin of appreciation. France and the United Kingdom can have different views on how to deal with secularism, with the prohibition of religious symbols, and we accept that. We should accept that. And I think it should be the same thing in Canada. The rest of Canada should accept that on these issues, Quebec might have a different way of thinking its relationship with religion and the rights and the way to limit, to some extent, the rights and freedoms that are in human rights charters.
I appreciate that, but I do want to follow up, and I don't want to get mired in the politics of Quebec in this thing, capital P, partisan politics, but I wonder, David, if by coming out as strongly against this Charter of Values as all 4 major national parties have, whether that in some respects plays into the hands of the separatist government, which will then say, you see, here we go again. Anytime Quebec wants to do its own thing and blaze its own trail, the rest of Canada comes out against us. That's why we need our own country. Are we playing that game again here?
Yeah, probably, but that's why the debate is just a debate for strategic considerations. But I would like to react to what Daniel Turp just said. When you said that Quebec was a distinct society with a distinct view of secularism, which is very surprising for me because 2 days ago, Madame Marois, the Prime Minister of Quebec, said that France was a good model of secularism and that we should inspire ourselves of this model in France. So how can we be so distinct if we constantly to refer as a colony of France? No, we have to remember that we already have our distinct model of secularism based on the Charter of Rights. That being said, I would like to say too that when we refer to certain kind of models of secularism, and especially in France, we don't refer to the reality of secularism in this country. Let me recall you that in France, the main principle of secularism affirmed in 1905 in the law of separation between church and state is the freedom of conscience and religion. The state guarantees the freedom of conscience and religion. In Quebec, we don't even guarantee this freedom of conscience and religion. And so maybe we have a different view of secularism, but we should, I think, remember that this view of secularism, it's an heritage of the past, of our history, our specificity, and of our charters of rights.
Okay, let me gently wade into another issue around all of this, and that is a generational issue. And I'm so glad to have you and Daniel Turp on the program to do this because, of course, you once took one of his classes, right?
I actually dropped the class.
You dropped Daniel Turp's class. I would love to see the 2 of them on a split screen right now.
Yeah.
Why did you drop my class?
Why did you drop his class?
To make it to the end there?
No, it was before the ad drop period actually ended. So, you know, I just, I got the course syllabus and I switched out. Yeah, I did.
Now,
you're always welcome back.
Oh, thanks.
We're not taking a position on whether it was, on who was in the right in that. But it does raise some generational issues that I want to get into. And Conrad Yakubuski wrote about this in the Globe and Mail many years ago, and yet it still rings true today. Let me read this comment, and then I'll get you both to comment. The quiet revolutionaries, who not only experienced religion as the means by which societal elders controlled them and earlier generations, can't seem to get their heads around the idea that Muslim women are not necessarily signaling their submission by wearing a hijab. They fought tooth and nail to get religion out of Quebec's public institutions, and they don't want to go there again. But many, mostly younger Quebecers, those who never felt the church's claws, don't carry the same baggage towards something their own parents never showed or taught them: faith. So, Daniel Turp, how about you first? Is this a generational issue that the younger people, like Supriya, it doesn't affect them the same way because they don't have memories of 1960 and Jean Lesage and the Quiet Revolution, etc.?
Yes, I think it is. It's a very good point. And I don't know if you're referring to Jakubowski's paper in today's Globe and Mail or an earlier paper. Because
no, this one was written 6 years ago.
Well, he writes a very good piece today. It's called The Core of Quebec's Charter, Republicanism and Feminism, which is another issue. But I recommend that you read and the people listening to us read it, because it's a lot. It has a lot to do with the way you think the state should be organized as a republic, where religion doesn't have a more important, and where feminists have also had a key say in the way religions deal with women and how they should be. But to answer your question on generations, I agree with you that when you're a younger Quebecer and you haven't seen the discrimination or seen intolerance by Catholics and by religious authorities towards other religions, well, you might not have that same kind of concern. You might not want to separate religion and state as much as those who saw how religion might have had an influence, and not a very good influence, on the way women were treated and or minorities were considered in Quebec. So I think it is an issue, and I would be curious to see how polls stratify the views of younger Quebecers and less younger Quebecers. The poll this morning in the Journal de Montréal doesn't make that distinction, or we don't see it in the newspapers.
Supriya, fair to say that your generation is less fussed about this because, frankly, you've never been oppressed by the Catholic Church. It's just, and you're born in Quebec, raised in Quebec,
right.
You've lived your whole life in Quebec. And the church has not oppressed you, I guess, right?
I mean, I guess that's a fair point, but I would like to point out that I'm actually a feminist myself, and I'm also an atheist. I'm a feminist largely because I'm an atheist, and vice versa. I don't think that any religion really puts on equal footing men and women, and that's a big part of why I became an atheist. And but to answer your question, I'm also Indian. So I've been to India many times. I know what it's like to have religion, be very open in terms of public life, and to have political parties use religion to create divide, and I'm obviously very against that. The issue in Quebec here is about appearances and about how a woman, whether or not is going to wear a hijab, how that affects her employment, which is ridiculous, or how it would affect how she's going to enact on her duties as a civil servant. And I just don't see the connection there. And I think Quebec has yet to make a real pressing case about that.
I'm fascinated by the fact, stand by 1 second, I need to follow this up.
Okay.
I am fascinated by the fact that you are an atheist, and yet you are arguing today on behalf of allowing people to wear religious objects, symbolism, whatever, when they work for the state.
I mean,
you ought to be on the other side of this thing.
I would if it was properly worded and if it had actual bearing. And if there was case after case after case of doctors and kippas saying, you know what, I'm not going to prescribe you antibiotics because it's God's way, or having a university professor in biology try and teach creationism because they're following their religious teachings, then we would actually have a proper conversation here. But I think this whole crisis is exactly what Bouchard-Taylor Commission came out to conclude, is that it's a crisis of perception. This is something that it's a perceived problem that doesn't really exist. It's a warped solution to a non-existent problem right now, and that's where Quebec is right now.
David, you wanted to reply.
Oh, I think it's completely a perceived problem. There is a social construction of a problem that does not exist on that point. And just recall you that we're talking about giving boundaries to reasonable accommodation. And the Minister Tranville said that for the first time in Quebec, we're going to define what is a reasonable accommodation. But actually, the Supreme Court of Canada defined or gave a clear definition of reasonable accommodation in 1985. That's to say 30 years ago. And the boundaries are defined since that date and applied by jurisdiction and public institutions. So that's true that maybe it could be important to recall these boundaries to make them more clear for the population. But there is nothing new because there is no social problem. Coming back on the religiosity and the reaction of Quebecois with the religious symbols, it's not because we have an history with Catholicism that we have to rule the expression of beliefs with our emotions. It is true that in Quebec, for all this generation of the Quiet Revolution, now it's difficult to understand an orthodox way to express religiosity, because orthodoxy is always interpreted as a domination, which is not right. So we have to focus on the right and not to rule with our perceptions of the relation to a god, a divinity, or and so on. So,
as we get more feedback from others who have weighed in on this, Daniel Turp, I'll get you first to comment on this piece that was written by Jonathan Kay in the National Post back on September 11th. He wrote, "If Pauline Marois, the Premier of Quebec, and her supporters were being more honest with themselves, the comic would have had but a single panel, an image of a veiled woman with a line through it. Face covering is what this is really about. Turbans, crosses, and Stars of David are all just collateral damage stuck in for the sake of ostensible religious neutrality. It simply wouldn't do for Ms. Marois to single out one religious faith for censure. So she created a policy that goes after everyone. There's really no politically correct way of saying it, but the truth of it is that the niqab is fundamentally creepy." Now, as we come out of that comment, I'd like, if we can, there, the control room has put up the picture of a woman wearing a niqab where all that we can see are her eyes. And Daniel Turp, is this, in effect, what really offends Quebec's sensibilities and what this debate is mostly about?
Well, to begin with, I'll tell you what I think about that comment. It's simplistic, and it's not very useful in a debate that has to be a democratic debate, and where people and sensibilities have to be expressed. And it's true that niqabs and burqas, I think, are not seen as acceptable. So for so many people, and including women, and that many countries have decided even to ban it in the public space, like France, and I think Belgium wants to do that. And Quebec, the Charter of Values doesn't address that issue of banning burqas and niqabs in the public space on the streets and giving fines to women that wear those niqabs and burqas. I think one should not underestimate the importance for a society or a country to deal with these issues and to try to find a solution in law, to adopt criteria and rules to deal with the issue of how religion and state, how to reconcile these concepts and the rights and fundamental freedom, like the fundamental freedom of religion. And it's not easy, and it's when you try to avoid the subject that problems become more important, like in some societies. And Germany and France and Turkey have all had to deal with these issues. The United Kingdom, today there's a decision in the UK by a UK tribunal that says that women have to remove the burqa when they testify. And that's contrary to some extent to the decision of the Supreme Court of Canada a few months ago. So I think you have to be very careful in the way you say things and write things, and not try to find Madame Marois or other people or presume bad intentions when you're discussing these very important fundamental issues.
Okay, understood. But Supriya, I want to get your reaction to something that took place just last week, and that is, well, let me go back for a second. We remember back in 1976 when the Parti Quebecois won its first, you wouldn't remember, you weren't born, but I remember, those of us of a certain age remember, there was quite an exodus, starting on Highway 20 in Quebec and then continuing on the 401, and a lot of Quebecers who were worried left. And let's bring this ad up if we can see this now, control room. This was something that the Lake Ridge Health Facility in Oshawa ran. We don't care what's on your head, the ad says, we care what's in it. And the picture, of course, of a doctor wearing a hijab. And I wonder whether people in Quebec are concerned that this value of Charter of Values could potentially lead to another exodus of people who will not feel comfortable, say that doctor with that headscarf on, will not feel comfortable living in Quebec anymore, and they'll leave.
I mean, absolutely. I don't know why anybody who was wearing a hijab and practiced in the public sector, turban or a kippah, would want to stay for fear of losing their job and for fear of just how they're perceived by their own government. So this is absolutely a concern, and I would say more to that is, you know, bringing back to the Quebec economy, it's not like jobs are plentiful as is. So why wouldn't you? This just seems like another layer and another reason to simply head west on the 401 in this case.
David, are you picking up any concern in the province of Quebec that if this were to go through, people would leave?
Yeah, absolutely. The thing is, the message sent by the government is dangerous. It's not, we want you to be integrated, it's, we want you to be assimilated, which is not the same. There is a symbolic effect which is very important. And I'm going to give you an example. 3 days ago, because I work a lot with community groups working with immigrants in the suburb of Montreal in Longueuil. And I was working there with these immigrant groups, and some women started to cry. And they started to cry. Why? They were not even Muslim. They were not even wearing a symbol. But they were crying because the message was, you, as an immigrant, you share some values that are not part of the Quebec. And I was very concerned. And when I left this meeting with this community group, I was completely stressed, concerned, because where are we going? What are these shared values? And yes, it's really a problem. I think it's a problem.
Daniel Turp, how about your view that this is an opening for people who are already nervous about Quebec to leave?
Well, to begin with, I think the reference to assimilation and this policy or these governmental orientations are intended to assimilate immigrants and not at all, you know, respect their values and their freedoms, fundamental freedoms, is very excessive. My colleague is very excessive in suggesting that there's assimilationist intentions in that policy. And I don't believe it will lead to an exodus and comparable to the exodus which was real in 1990 and 76, as you pointed out, of English-speaking Quebecers. But at the same time, I don't like the idea that the mayor of Calgary or these people in Ontario and try to benefit from the situation and say to people, well, you know, you're not welcome to Quebec here, come to Ontario, come to Alberta. They're certainly not helping their cause.
Sorry, aren't they exactly helping their cause? It seems like, to me, they're just capitalizing on Quebec's sort of intolerant tone right now. And to me, if you're the mayor of Calgary or this hospital in Ontario, you want those people. This
is not intolerant. And I disagree with the idea that what the policy that's brought is intolerant. If Quebec is intolerant, well, France is, Germany is, Turkey is, countries that have decided that the state would be neutral, would not allow civil servants to wear religious symbols, are not intolerant.
Right,
they're different. They're different, and they decide to organize the way they deal with freedom of religion and the wearing of symbols in the civil service differently.
Yeah,
that's not intolerance.
Right, absolutely. But as you pointed out yourself, Professor Turp, Quebec is employing a sort of inconsistency here, and I would call it selective secularism, in that they are targeting minority religions, and that is what I'm calling intolerant here, and that is what the mayor of Calgary and this ad for an Ontario hospital, that's what they're capitalizing on. If it applied to all religions equally, I think people would be they would have a lot less to say about this, but it doesn't, and I think that is the intolerant part here. You know, France doesn't also allow municipal council meetings to begin with prayers that have God guide them, the council, through their decisions. Quebec does, and nowhere in the Quebec Charter is it proposed to put a ban on these prayer meetings. France also doesn't publicly subsidize religious schooling. Quebec still does. These are issues that the Charter doesn't address.
And it should, and I argue for inconsistency, as you heard, and maybe the mayor of Calgary should, rather than suggesting people move to Calgary, ask Quebec to be consistent and treat all religions on the same footing, and I think that would be much more positive, much more constructive.
David, with just a few minutes left here, let me ask you this. Are you concerned about how we know this is being picked up by the international media? Are you concerned at how Quebec looks to the rest of the world right now?
Well, I'm concerned. Being an immigrant, I'm concerned because when I arrived in Quebec, I was a French citizen, so I know this famous model of integration, which does not have really the good effects of integration that are presented by the government. But I am concerned because why did I come to Quebec? Because I was sharing these values of rights, because it was a country of rights, and that was my values. And I'm not religious, I don't wear a religious symbol, and I'm concerned because it's not the image of Quebec I had before. So I'm concerned because we're not anymore this tolerant country we were, and I don't think it's a tolerant policy that's proposed by the government. We're not tolerant anymore, and I'm concerned by this image. It's not my values, it's not my Quebec, it's not the Quebec in which I decided to move.
I've got about a minute left here in Cypria. I should ask you, you are a young, visible minority woman who grew up, lived not in downtown Montreal, but you actually grew up outside Montreal.
I did.
How was that?
You know, I would assume growing up as an immigrant or a visible minority rather, in Quebec is analogous to anywhere else in Canada. You know, I never faced any racism or prejudice, much to the surprise, I guess, to a lot of Canadians who like to paint Quebec as being more intolerant or more racist, especially, than the rest of Canada. But to be quite honest, I never experienced any of that. Then again, I would also like to point out that I spoke French fluently. I don't know if you can pick up on this, but it was probably pretty hard to pick on me as a kid, if you can imagine.
Because you're tough.
Yeah, you know, and I grew up privileged economically, so I don't think it's not the same as if I was born in India, spoke heavily accented French or no French at all, and you know, grew up in a lower SES class than I did.
But you know that when Jacques Parizeau talked about the money in the ethnic vote,
right?
I mean, he's talking about you and your family.
Yeah, I guess so. You might as well have said the Divettis.
And I didn't like that at all.
Yes, no, and you've been clear on that.
Oh, yes. When Mr. Parizeau said that, I was very upset, and I still am. But on the international or on these issues,
I literally have 20 seconds here, Mr. Sherp.
Well, just as some make some comparisons now between the language and this issue of Charter of Values. It was very tough in the 70s when Quebec adopted the Charter of French language. Everyone said we were intolerant. And now the same thing happens again with this Charter of Values.
We'll keep watching. I want to thank everybody for participating in today's program, particularly to two of our guests who do this in their second language. I dare say there aren't many academics at English Canadian institutions who could do this conversation in French. So we're grateful to Daniel Turp from the Université de Montréal, to David Coussons from the University of Sherbrooke, and of course here in our studio to Cypria Divetti, the political commentator on CJAD in Montreal. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.